There are stories that begin with a fleeting moment of chaos, an event so out of place that it shakes you to your core. But what happens when that chaos isn't an anomaly? What if it's part of a deeper, more terrifying narrative that was quietly taking shape in the shadows? This is the story of Mark Twitchell, a man whose obsession with a fictional character turned him into a real-life killer. It was the fall of 2008 when Edmonton, Alberta, would be forever marked by a brutal crime that seemed to be lifted straight from the screen of a television show. Twitchell, a 29-year-old aspiring filmmaker, had long harbored a fascination with violence, a fascination that grew into an obsession with Dexter, a TV show about a bloodspatter analyst who moonlights as a vigilante serial killer. But behind this fascination, something much darker was taking root. On the surface, Mark Twitchell appeared to be just another ordinary man, with a passion for filmmaking, a quiet presence in the community, and a life that many would describe as typical. But as the layers of his life began to peel away, a chilling truth emerged. Twitchell's obsession with Dexter didn't just end with watching the show. It seeped into his very psyche, shaping his thoughts, his actions, and ultimately, his reality. In the confines of his rented garage, Twitchell began to construct a fantasy world where he was the central figure, the one who could control life and death, the one who could decide who lived and who died. The garage became his kill room, an eerie replication of the one scene on Dexter, where he would carry out his twisted desires. But it wasn't just a story he was creating for a film. This was his blueprint for murder, and it was a plan he was about to execute. The victim, John Brian Altinger. A man just like many others, living a normal life, looking for connection, perhaps a bit naive in his search for love through online dating. Altinger's path crossed with Twitchell's in a seemingly innocent way, and that was all it took. Twitchell lured him to the garage, where Altinger would meet a gruesome fate. In the darkness of that garage, Mark Twitchell became the character he had long admired on TV, not the hero, but the cold, calculated killer. What had begun as a harmless obsession with a fictional character turned into a real-life nightmare for one man and an entire community. But the story doesn't end there. The chilling details of the murder, the twisted logic behind it, and the depths of Twitchell's delusions would all come to light in the weeks and months that followed. Before we dive into this unbelievable case, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so that you'll never miss any of the chilling cases we cover. Mark Twitchell was, by all outward appearances, an ordinary man, one whose life could have easily blended into the background of any other. Born on July 4, 1979, in Edmonton, Alberta, Twitchell had the typical upbringing of a child in a middle-class family. But as time went on, the darker currents of his mind began to pull him into a world where fantasy and reality were not so easily separated. Growing up, Twitchell was always a bit of an outsider. He had an affinity for creativity and storytelling, but his social skills were often lacking. Where some children had a natural ease in connecting with others, Twitchell felt more comfortable in his own world, creating elaborate stories and fantasies in his mind. His childhood was marked by a sense of loneliness, and as he entered adulthood, this feeling only grew more intense. Twitchell was drawn to the world of filmmaking, a place where he could construct his own reality, a place where he could be the creator of his own narratives. It was here that his passion for storytelling flourished, but this passion began to take a much darker turn. He began to experiment with creating violent films, with blood and murder at the center of his plots. The more he immersed himself in the world of cinema, the more obsessed he became with the idea of violence, vengeance, and control. It was around this time that Twitchell became infatuated with the TV series Dexter, a show about a man who was, on the surface, a forensic expert, but beneath it all, he was a serial killer. Dexter Morgan, the show's protagonist, carried out his killings in a methodical and controlled manner, a vigilante who sought to rid the world of criminals, all while hiding his true nature from the people around him. To Twitchell, Dexter was not just a character on a screen. He was a role model, an ideal that he could aspire to be. Twitchell's life began to revolve around Dexter. He started to see himself not just as a filmmaker, but as someone capable of carrying out the same sort of vigilantism that he had seen in the show. His desire to create films shifted to a more disturbing goal: to experience the violence firsthand, to live the fantasies he had been obsessing over. He began to see murder not as a crime, but as a way to make his own life more exciting, to make himself the central character in his own twisted story. His obsession with Dexter wasn't just a passive interest. It became a driving force, one that twisted his reality and led him down a path that would forever change the course of his life and the lives of others. But this wasn't just about a fascination with a TV show. It was about his growing dissatisfaction with his own existence, his inability to find connection with the people around him, and his yearning to create a life where he could control everything, even life and death. In his quiet moments, Twitchell might have seen himself as the hero of his own film, where every victim was just another character in his narrative, one who could be disposed of in order for the story to move forward. And so, as his obsession deepened, so did the darkness inside him. What began as a desire to make films, to create art, soon became a desire to create chaos. But the chaos he sought wasn't just for the screen, it would soon spill into the real world. John Brian Altinger was a man who lived a quiet, ordinary life. Born in Edmonton, Alberta, he worked as a mechanical engineer, a job that, while not flashy, provided him with a stable income and a sense of purpose. Altinger was someone who blended into the background of society, a man who didn't crave the spotlight but sought connection in the small, meaningful ways that so many of us do. He wasn't looking for violence, wasn't seeking conflict. All he wanted was companionship, a chance to meet someone special. In the days before his death, Altinger had been navigating the often unpredictable world of online dating. Like so many others, he turned to the internet to find companionship, to meet someone who could fill the emptiness that sometimes comes with living a life that, though stable, felt incomplete. Altinger was an idealistic man in this regard, someone who believed in the possibility of love and connection, even in a digital age where relationships sometimes felt distant and detached. It was through a dating website that he first met Sheena. She was a woman who seemed to understand him, someone who presented herself as a potential match, a chance at a new relationship. Her profile seemed legitimate, the conversations were casual but engaging, and soon, Altinger believed that he had found someone who could change the course of his life. The two exchanged messages, and it wasn't long before they agreed to meet. To Altinger, this meeting was just another step in the journey of finding love. He saw nothing out of the ordinary. The rendezvous was set for a quiet, private garage that Sheena had suggested. It seemed like an ordinary date. Yet, this simple decision, this choice to meet a woman from the internet, would mark the last decision Altinger would ever make. Altinger had no reason to suspect that the woman he was about to meet wasn't who she claimed to be. What he didn't know was that Sheena didn't exist. The person he was meeting was Mark Twitchell, a man who had already mapped out every detail of this encounter, not as a romantic date, but as the prelude to a brutal murder. As Altinger entered the garage, he had no idea that he was walking into a carefully planned death trap. Twitchell, posing as Sheena, had orchestrated this meeting for one reason: to recreate his own fantasy. It wasn't about love or connection. It was about control, about power, and about taking a life. John Altinger was just another pawn in a twisted narrative that Mark Twitchell had written for himself. The details of what happened next remain chilling in their simplicity. Twitchell attacked Altinger, overpowering him in the confines of the garage, and in a cruel echo of Dexter's fictional world, he dismembered the body, seeking to dispose of the evidence as if it were a prop in a movie. The cold, calculated nature of the crime stands in stark contrast to the man Altinger had been just hours earlier, a man seeking nothing more than connection, than to find someone who could share in his life. For John Altinger, the tragic reality is that his search for love ended in an unimaginable betrayal. His trusting nature, his desire for human connection, led him down a path where he was met not with affection but with violence. Twitchell's fantasy, once confined to the realm of fiction, had come to life in the most horrific way imaginable. And Altinger paid the ultimate price for the brief moment of trust he placed in a man who was nothing like the woman he had imagined. It was a crisp fall evening when Mark Twitchell's twisted plan began to unfold. On the surface, it appeared to be just another ordinary date. A meeting between two people who had connected online, seeking companionship in a world where relationships often seemed fleeting. But what John Altinger didn't know as he entered the rented garage that night was that he had stepped into a trap, a trap carefully crafted by a man whose life had become a series of delusions, fueled by obsession and fantasy. Twitchell's meticulous planning was clear in every detail of the crime. It wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment act of violence, it was a carefully executed attempt to live out a fantasy he had long harbored, one influenced by his obsession with the TV show Dexter. In Dexter, the protagonist, a forensic expert by day and a vigilante serial killer by night, uses a special kill room to dispose of his victims in a way that ensures no trace of evidence remains. Twitchell, inspired by this fictional world, had recreated his own version of the kill room in a rented garage on the outskirts of Edmonton. It wasn't just a murder, it was a performance for Twitchell. He didn't simply want to kill, he wanted to orchestrate a scene that mirrored the show that had consumed his mind. Every element was preordained: the isolation of the garage, the lack of witnesses, the way the crime was carried out. It was all a reproduction of what he had watched on TV. To Twitchell, this wasn't just a life-ending event for Altinger. It was the enactment of a personal fantasy, one where he could play the role of the executioner, the vigilante, the one who had ultimate control over life and death. Altinger arrived at the garage, unaware of the danger that lay ahead. He had no reason to believe that the woman he thought he was meeting, the woman he had communicated with for days, didn't exist. She was a fiction created by Twitchell, an illusion designed to lure him into a deadly encounter. When Altinger walked through the door, he was immediately confronted with the dark reality of the situation. Twitchell attacked him almost immediately. The violence was brutal and swift. Twitchell, having prepared himself for the act for weeks, knew exactly what to do. The garage, designed to mirror Dexter's kill room, was filled with tools, plastic sheeting, and other items intended to make the dismemberment of the body as clean as possible. There was no hesitation. Altinger fought for his life, but Twitchell had already planned for this. The scene was violent, a shocking and sudden end to a life that had been filled with simple desires, to connect with another human being. Twitchell's meticulous nature didn't end with the attack. After killing Altinger, he dismembered the body, taking deliberate steps to dispose of the evidence. His actions were cold, methodical, and calculated, the very traits he had admired in Dexter. To Twitchell, this was not a murder, it was a rite of passage, the moment he could finally step into the role he had created for himself. He wasn't just killing a man, he was living out the fantasy that had taken over his life, where every detail had been planned, where every step was in his control. And yet, despite the careful planning, Twitchell made a critical mistake. The act itself may have been orchestrated like a scene from a movie, but the reality of murder is far messier than fiction. Twitchell failed to erase all traces of the crime, leaving behind a trail of evidence that would eventually lead to his undoing. His obsession with creating the perfect crime would prove to be his downfall. At the heart of Mark Twitchell's crime lies a mind both complex and deeply disturbed, a mind that blurred the lines between fantasy and reality until it was no longer clear where one ended and the other began. Mark Twitchell was not just a man who committed a brutal murder. He was a man whose obsession with violence, vengeance, and control had been building for years. His actions were the culmination of a deeply ingrained psychological descent, one that stemmed from a combination of narcissism, delusion, and a compulsive need for power. Twitchell's fascination with Dexter was not merely a casual interest, it was the cornerstone of his identity. The character of Dexter Morgan, a man who carried out his vigilante killings with cold precision and a sense of moral righteousness, became Twitchell's ideal. For Dexter, murder was an act of justice, a way to rid the world of criminals who had escaped the legal system. For Twitchell, however, murder was not about justice. It was about creating a life where he had control, where he could write his own script, free from the constraints of society and morality. In many ways, Twitchell saw himself as the central character in a twisted narrative. He wasn't just a man with problems, he was the protagonist in a film, and everyone around him was simply a supporting character. The lines between reality and fiction blurred in his mind. To him, murder wasn't a crime, it was an act of artistic expression, a way to enact the violence he had seen on screen. He had created his own story, where he was not the victim of his circumstances but the one with the power to shape events. This deep-seated narcissism, The belief that he was entitled to control and shape the world around him drove much of Twitchell's behavior. He saw himself as superior to others, as someone who could act as judge, jury, and executioner. In his eyes, his actions were justified, as he was carrying out what he believed to be a greater purpose. Like Dexter, he was acting out of a warped sense of morality, believing that his actions would somehow be validated by his own vision of justice. But underneath this veneer of control and self-righteousness lay a deep and unsettling delusion. Twitchell was not simply pretending to be a killer, he genuinely believed that he could separate himself from the real-world consequences of his actions. He saw his murders as a form of artistic expression, a way to escape the mediocrity of his own life. His obsession with Dexter had given him a template for his crimes, and in his delusion, he convinced himself that he was merely enacting a role, a performance on a grand stage. Twitchell's delusion was further compounded by his inability to see the humanity in his victims. John Altinger, to Twitchell, wasn't a man with a life, a family, and a future. He was simply a character in a script, a victim who would play his part in Twitchell's twisted narrative. This lack of empathy, this complete disconnect from the real emotions of others, is a hallmark of the narcissistic personality. Twitchell's ability to dehumanize Altinger allowed him to commit such a horrific crime with minimal emotional turmoil. As his obsession with Dexter grew, so did his desire to act out his fantasies. The murder of John Altinger was the logical next step in Twitchell's mind. It wasn't enough to just fantasize about killing, he needed to experience it for himself. In his deluded world, he wasn't committing a crime. He was simply following the plot of the show, playing out his version of what he saw as justice. His actions were not a result of fleeting emotion or a temporary lapse in judgment. They were the product of a mind that had become completely disconnected from reality, where murder was no longer seen as an act of violence but as a means of self-expression. For Mark Twitchell, the thrill of his first murder did not quench his obsession. In the dark recesses of his mind, he had now tasted the kind of power he had long craved, the ability to take a life, to mold reality to fit his twisted vision. But as is often the case with those driven by unchecked narcissism, once the taste for violence had been awakened, it wasn't easily satisfied. Twitchell, emboldened by his success, sought to repeat the act. His next victim was already on the horizon, a man named Glenn W. Another unsuspecting individual who, like John Altinger, was seeking companionship through online dating. Twitchell once again posed as Sheena, the woman his victims thought they were meeting. This time, however, the outcome would not go as planned. Glenn W. had agreed to meet Sheena, and the arrangement was set. He arrived at the same garage, believing he was about to meet a woman for a date, much like Altinger had done just weeks before. But there was something that set this encounter apart, something that Twitchell had not anticipated. Glenn W. was not the same as Altinger. As Glenn walked into the garage, he immediately sensed that something was off. The eerie, isolated location, the setup of the room, it all felt wrong. Instinct kicked in, and something about the situation made Glenn uneasy. At that moment, Glenn realized that he was not walking into a simple date but rather a dangerous, deadly situation. In a remarkable act of presence of mind, Glenn began to turn the situation around. He questioned Twitchell, sensing that the person before him was not who he appeared to be. Twitchell's nervous demeanor only heightened Glenn's suspicion, and within moments, Glenn managed to flee the scene. As he raced out of the garage and into the night, he was terrified, knowing he had narrowly escaped death. Twitchell, in his pursuit of control and satisfaction, found himself frustrated by the failed attempt. He had set everything in motion once again, confident that his plan would succeed, but Glenn's escape was a wake-up call. The illusion of invulnerability that Twitchell had built around himself began to crack. His first victim, John Altinger, had been the perfect target, vulnerable, unsuspecting, and trusting. But Glenn W. was different. He had managed to break free, alerting the authorities to the danger he had narrowly avoided. This close call became the turning point in the investigation, and for Twitchell, it marked the beginning of the unraveling of his carefully constructed facade. Though his second attempt had failed, it did not deter him. In his delusional mind, he still believed that he could play the role of the killer, the master of life and death. But the world was beginning to see the cracks in his plan. And soon, those cracks would widen. For Glenn, the escape wasn't just a stroke of luck. It was a testament to the power of intuition and the quick thinking that saved his life. His decision to trust his instincts that night would set in motion the chain of events that would ultimately bring Mark Twitchell to justice. But for Twitchell, the failed attempt wasn't the end. It was only a small bump on the road to the darkness he had so carefully plotted. As the hours passed after Glenn W.'s escape, Mark Twitchell likely felt the weight of his failures settling heavily upon him. His meticulous planning had come so close to being flawless, but a single moment of hesitation from his victim had disrupted his narrative. The escape was a crack in the armor he had spent so long constructing, and what followed would be the inevitable collapse of his carefully fabricated world. Though Twitchell managed to escape detection for a short time after the failed murder attempt, the authorities were not far behind. The police investigation into the murder of John Altinger had already been underway, and Glenn W.'s escape only served as the crucial tipping point. What Twitchell hadn't accounted for was the digital age in which he lived, a time when every move could be tracked, every detail left behind. In his desperation, Twitchell had made several critical mistakes that would ultimately lead to his downfall. Among the most damning pieces of evidence was the file found on his computer, entitled SK Confessions. It was in this document that Twitchell had openly detailed his thoughts, his plans, and his rationale for the murders he had committed and the ones he intended to carry out. It was a chilling glimpse into his delusional mindset, a mind that had convinced itself that the killings were justified, that he was somehow above the law, and that he could act as both the judge and the executioner. As the police began to piece together the evidence, they found Twitchell's digital footprint. His obsession with Dexter was evident in his online activity, from his research into the show's methods to his attempts to recreate Dexter's kill room. The parallels between the fictional world of Dexter and the real-world murder of John Altinger were undeniable. Twitchell had essentially left behind a blueprint for his crimes, a detailed account of everything he had done and intended to do. By the time the police closed in on him, Twitchell's world had already begun to crumble. The very elements that he believed would shield him, his calculated planning, his obsession with secrecy, had instead become the very things that would betray him. On October 31, 2008, just weeks after the failed murder of Glenn W., Mark Twitchell was arrested. Twitchell's arrest was a moment of shock for many. The man who had once dreamed of becoming a filmmaker, whose passion for the dark arts of storytelling had driven him to kill, was now facing the harsh consequences of his actions. His arrest was a symbol of the collapse of his delusions, a reminder that the line between fantasy and reality had been irreparably blurred. For Twitchell, the fantasy had come to an end, and he was left to face the consequences of his violence. But the aftermath of Twitchell's crime was not just a matter of legal consequence. The shockwaves reverberated through the lives of those who knew him. His friends, family, and colleagues were forced to grapple with the truth about the man they had thought they knew, a man whose dark, hidden life had remained concealed behind a mask of normalcy. For his ex-wife, the woman who had once shared her life with him, the truth was unbearable. The man she had married had turned out to be someone entirely different, someone capable of unimaginable cruelty. The case also had a profound impact on the public. Edmonton, a city known for its tranquility, had never seen a crime like this. The idea that a man could be inspired by a fictional character to commit murder sent a chilling message about the potential dangers of unchecked obsession. Twitchell's case sparked debates about the influence of media, particularly violent television shows, on vulnerable individuals who could not distinguish between the fantasies they consumed and the reality in which they lived. It raised uncomfortable questions about the power of entertainment to shape one's worldview and the extent to which it could influence a person's behavior. Mark Twitchell's story is one that lingers in the mind long after the details of his crimes have been revealed. It is a case that challenges the boundaries between fiction and reality, between the fantasy of television and the brutal truth of human violence. Twitchell was not just a man who mimicked a fictional killer, he was a man who sought to become the very thing he admired. And in his pursuit of this dark ideal, he destroyed lives, shattered families, and forever altered his own. When we step back and look at the broader implications of the Mark Twitchell case, we are confronted with uncomfortable truths about human nature and the power of media. Twitchell's obsession with Dexter wasn't just an isolated fixation. It was the catalyst for a deeply rooted delusion, a distorted view of the world in which the boundaries between right and wrong, good and evil, were not so clearly defined. Twitchell believed, in his mind, that he was a figure of justice, that his actions were justified by the fantasy world he had created for himself. But in reality, he was a man who had lost touch with morality, who had allowed his obsessions to consume him entirely. The case raises important questions about the power of the media on vulnerable individuals. Twitchell's crimes were not merely inspired by Dexter, they were shaped by it. For someone with a fragile sense of self, a deep sense of isolation, and an inability to form meaningful connections, the world of fiction can offer an escape, a chance to live vicariously through characters who seem to control their fate. But for Twitchell, this escape didn't remain in the world of TV. His obsession crossed into reality, where the fantasy of Dexter became a justification for his own violent actions. In many ways, Twitchell's case is a chilling reminder of the dangers of unchecked obsession. It illustrates how, in the wrong hands, fiction can become more than just entertainment. It can become a dangerous blueprint, a path to justification for behaviors that would otherwise be unimaginable. Twitchell didn't just watch Dexter, he sought to live it, to emulate the very things he saw on screen. He transformed the ideas of justice and retribution into a personal mission, with tragic consequences for the people around him. But the case is not just about the influence of the media. It is also a stark reflection of human vulnerability, particularly the vulnerability of those who feel isolated, misunderstood, or rejected. Twitchell's desire for power and control over others may have stemmed from a deep-seated need to assert dominance over a life that he felt was slipping through his fingers. By playing out the fantasy of being the central character in his own movie, he believed he could erase his feelings of impotence. However, the reality of what he did, the devastating impact it had on John Altinger's family and his own, is a testament to the destructiveness of this mindset. For the people who knew Twitchell, his family, friends, colleagues, his arrest and the subsequent revelations were a shocking betrayal. The man they thought they knew was revealed to be someone completely different, someone who harbored violent impulses that no one could have imagined. His ex-wife, in particular, had to come to terms with the terrifying reality that the man she had once shared her life with was capable of such brutal acts. The case also serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked obsession and the importance of understanding the psychological underpinnings of violent behavior. It compels us to think about how obsession can shape one's worldview, and how the line between fiction and reality can sometimes become dangerously thin. Twitchell's delusion wasn't just the product of watching Dexter, it was a narrative he created for himself, a narrative that led him to believe that murder was a justified act of control. The story of Mark Twitchell is one that leaves us with more questions than answers. It is a tragedy of a life that spiraled out of control, a story of a man who became consumed by his fantasies until they overtook his sense of morality, humanity, and logic. Twitchell's crimes serve as a grim reminder of how easily someone can become lost in their own delusions, and how dangerous it can be when fiction is allowed to define reality. As we reflect on this case, we are reminded of the complexities of the human mind, of the need for connection, and the consequences of allowing our darkest fantasies to lead us down paths of destruction. For John Altinger, and for the others who came after him, Twitchell's story is a tragic reminder that sometimes the real-life consequences of fiction can be more devastating than we ever imagine.